author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special Election 2024 edition, we'll be examining the defection of RFK Jr. from Democrat to independent to supporting Trump in the battleground states. We'll be looking at Kamala Harris, her strategy and her plans, and a whole lot more. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. It's going to be quite the show. We're joined by a very special guest, so let's get started. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has suspended elements of his campaign and is now all in for Donald Trump. What does that mean for the election going forward? All this and more on today's show, and we're very lucky to have with us longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, who also happens to be Liberty Nation's senior political analyst. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Pleasure, Mark.
So, Tim, it's been a fairly quiet couple of weeks in politics, not too much happening, but
no,
I thought we'd...
like most of the campaign, just a real yawner, Mark.
I thought we'd
yawner.
Scrape the bottom of the electoral barrel and discuss what it means for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to now be on Team Trump. I think, obviously kidding aside, I think this is quite monumentous, not so much for what it could mean electorally, although we will get to that, I'm sure. But it seems to me that it's a seismic shift in what it means to be a Democrat or a Republican in America.
Well, I mean, when you think of the word Democrat over the last half century or more, the first name that comes to mind is Kennedy, the 35th president, a senator from New York, an attorney general who might well have become president. Both of them, of course, were assassinated. But the party has always had a Kennedy element to it. And I would say electorally, it's questionable what kind of effect this will have. But culturally, politically, going forward, it could, if you extrapolate to the end, it could be the basis for a realignment of the parties. Because you take on top of what we've seen, the fact that Donald Trump seems to be attracting more minority voters than ever, introduces a new dynamic into the race. And it's not favorable for Kamala Harris. Let's just put it that way. We don't know how favorable it'll be for Donald Trump, but, you know, Annie Kennedy, especially carrying the name of the assassinated martyr, basically from 1968. Anybody carrying that name, but especially Robert F. Kennedy, endorsing any Republican, not to mention the most controversial Republican of the modern age. That's huge. That's huge news. Now, of course, the mainstream media, or I use air quotes when I say that, but the elite media, big media, corporate media is doing their best to just ignore the story, to marginalize him. For example, there was a big story immediately that said, this was a predictable angle, Bobby Kennedy, who fought his whole professional adult life for environmental justice, has now endorsed the most anti-environmental president in the history of the country. So they're trying to marginalize him and say he's a coup. But I think you agree with some, none, or all of Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s policies. He is a most compelling political figure because of his willingness to step out of the box, just like Trump, his willingness to discuss issues that would otherwise be buried, most specifically the health of children. So this is a bombshell, whether it's an electoral bombshell this year or not. There's going to be consequences for this going forward for the Democratic Party and for Republicans. We've already seen a realignment where the Republicans have now essentially become the party of the working class, the Democrats, the party of the elites. I can tell you, Mark, if you had stepped back in time 30 years and told someone that that would be the state of play in 2024, they would have asked you to seek psychiatric help.
Mm. Yeah, it's an earthquake at the very foundational level of what it means to be engaged in one or the other parties, I think. And something that Bobby Kennedy pointed out during his speech when he suspended parts of his campaign. We'll get into that. When he suspended
significant parts.
The important bits, right?
Right.
And he called the Democratic Party, he called them the neocons. And, it's always kind of rattling around in the back of my mind that kind of phrase actually could apply to a significant portion of the current Democrats in Congress. Now, he may have meant it with an almost vindictive strike because they've treated him quite badly as you say, as a scion of the Kennedy family, to not even really allow him to run for president under their banner, and then to sue him 7 ways to Sunday to try and keep him off ballots. But to refer to them as neocons, I think that's going to resonate with a lot of people, isn't it?
Well, let's do another rewind. This time we'll go back 20 years to 2004. As you recall, the striking narrative of the 2004 election was the Iraq War and the fact that George W. Bush had expanded basically the portfolio of his incursion into the Middle East. At that point, Democrats were so opposed to a neoconservative foreign policy that they used it as largely the basis of John Kerry's campaign against Bush in 2004. So again, if you rewound 20 years and told people in 2004 that the Democrats would be the neoconservatives now, and the Republicans will be some would call it isolationist, but hands-off foreign policy. Again, people would think you're crazy, but this is how the realignment is gone. And I think, Mark, that what put neoconservatism into the Democratic Party was Barack Obama, because he came into office facing a number of crises, and he decided to basically strengthen, to a great extent, our foreign alliances rather than diminish them, which a lot of people thought that he would. And I think it made, let's put it this way, maybe Barack Obama made neoconservatism great again, right? He sort of adopted that, and then it became also something of a oppositional point to Donald Trump, because, of course, he, in the most audacious move ever in 2016 in the South Carolina primary, he attacked George W. Bush and said that it was an immoral war and Bush never should have gotten us into it. He's responsible for all the debt. I mean, that was a shocking thing. But it also created an oppositional position that the Democrats would pounce on because, of course, if Donald Trump says A, they have to say B. And if he says B, they have to say C. So I think that's something of the evolution, and also the general bent towards a globalist agenda. We're a lot further ahead in terms of the interconnectivity of the world than we were 20 years ago. And that makes control that much easier And it's easier to command and control if you have a global impact more than just a national impact.
We'll be continuing this conversation after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're continuing our conversation with Liberty Nation senior political analyst Tim Donner. Earlier in the show, we were talking Robert F. Kennedy's impact by jumping ship to Donald Trump. We discussed a little bit, Tim, how there's been a bit of a shift in the parties, especially in terms of now the Republican Party seems more the party of the working class and the anti-war brigade, whereas that used to be very much a Democratic staple. And I'm wondering, Tim, and I think this is right, I might have it slightly wrong, but part of this is because Donald Trump himself was never really a Republican. Does that make sense?
He was always more of a Pat Buchanan, Ross Perot style gadfly, outsider independent, who simply realized that he had to be candidate of one of the two major parties if he actually wanted to become president. And a lot of people will say, well, he changed his position on a lot of things, but what informed that was the fact that Donald Trump operated in the Manhattan political climate for his entire business career. And if you operate in Manhattan, which is roughly 92% Democratic, you can't be an outspoken conservative. You can't be pro-life. You can't be against tax hikes and that sort of thing. So he sort of played along because he had to for business. But I think nobody questions the sincerity of his views now since 2016. And for example, something like the pro-life position, and we're getting off on a bit of a tangent, but the pro-life position is something where he is not a believing Christian like most pro-life people, but believing Christians believe that he will protect them, believes that he will protect the pro-life position as he did. So obviously by naming 3 justices to the Supreme Court who ultimately contributed to the overturning of Roe versus Wade.
Yeah, it's I don't think anybody could really doubt his bona fides. I mean, he really has gone to the wall for what I think what many people were looking for in a conservative, what many conservatives were looking for in a Republican, because conservative and Republican aren't necessarily the same thing. And it seems that there's been this massive reshaping of the party, but that many within those parties haven't quite realized what we on the outside can see taking shape. And do you think that's because there's almost an innate instinct to preserve what the party is that they joined? I mean, we have seen some people jump ship, obviously Robert F. Kennedy being the main one there, but we've also seen from the Republican side, we've seen Adam Kinzinger go full Democrat, as it were. But then you also have somebody like Tulsi Gabbard who's a Democrat, who's saying some very positive things about the Trump campaign. And it seems people are trying to realign themselves. And I'm hoping, just for the sake of political honesty across all sides, that what we'll see is people will change sides based on their positions, based on their genuinely held beliefs, rather than party rhetoric that, as you pointed out, for example, Trump in Manhattan had to claim.
Mm-hmm.
What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you can see mostly from anecdotal evidence, but also with polling, which now has to be redone because, of course, Kamala Harris is a very different candidate demographically than Joe Biden. So I think we need to revisit the idea of the minority vote as we get towards the middle to end of September to see how it's playing out, because that was one of the big losses that Joe Biden suffered. Now, that could potentially contribute at least to a realignment of the parties. But I mean, make no mistake, the most remarkable thing about Donald Trump is that, and what makes him a unique figure in American history, was that he single-handedly took a party of the rich and elite plutocrats like Mitt Romney, who was a candidate as recently as 2012, who was largely beaten because he was seen as a plutocrat and a rich elite.
Yeah, I'll bet you $10,000.
And Donald Trump single-handedly turned the party in an entirely different direction. Now, of course, he kept some things the same. He still believes in the same libertarian principles and low taxes and the like that are the sort of the mother's milk of conservative thought. But at the same time, he just took the party, dragged them kicking and screaming into his own image. And I don't think you can say anybody has ever accomplished that single-handedly before. You might say FDR, the New Deal, but that was an emergency situation, and the Democrats were already headed in a leftist direction. So you could probably point to some other places in history where a single man made a significant difference. Teddy Roosevelt, for example, took the Republican Party into the direction of trustbusters, antitrust, anti-big corporations. U.S. Steel, for example, the steel monopoly. But, for the most part, Donald Trump has achieved something nobody could have ever imagined. Now, the question is the party that he created from whole cloth, single-handedly, is that the party that we'll have after this election? Because I guarantee you, if Donald Trump loses, the party will not go in a MAGA direction. A safer strategy with someone like a Nikki Haley, as the Democrats will have pitched their tent on the extreme left, having won 4 elections by progressives out of the last 5, 2 terms of Obama plus Biden plus Harris, establishes clearly a progressive era. But, and this is the stakes here, if Trump wins, we largely will see the end of the progressive era. I mean, that's how huge the stakes are, just objectively in terms of the difference between a Harris victory and a Trump victory. I mean, you can say the stakes are greater than ever, but I think the bookends of the possible outcomes are more extreme than ever before.
And that's what we'll be finding out as we get closer to the election. We'll be back with Tim Donner talking Kamala Harris. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
With the DNC in the rearview mirror, is the honeymoon period over for Kamala Harris, as now she must at some point face the press, the public, and her policy pitfalls? We're very fortunate to have back with us Liberty Nation senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Tim Donner. Tim, thanks for coming back.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
So we've discussed the different bumps that Kamala Harris has received. First, obviously, she was ordained courtesy of Joe Biden's withdrawal.
Good word.
Isn't it just? I like to go with coronation, but it seems that's not suitable for the Americas. It has. And then, of course, there was getting the delegates to virtually agree, virtually rather than virtually, agree to make her the nominee. Then there was the Tim Walz as vice president. Then there was the DNC Love Fest. And each of those has provided a boost to Kamala Harris. But all of those things are now past tense. What happens next?
Well, unfortunately for Kamala Harris, joy is not actually a policy. I mean, you can't legislate joy.
Sure.
So that's going to be over for her. And I think what she's going to try to do, obviously, to now, she has avoided the media like a plague. She has only done scripted, teleprompted speeches to selected audiences. She's done a couple of wave-bys on the tarmac, but essentially she's doing what she should do, which is to avoid talking to the media for as long as she can get away with it. And she's looking at about 75 days, give or take now. I think they may believe that they can sort of run out the clock. They'll do one interview at the end of this month. I don't know who she's going to do it with, but if it's like with Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, it's not going to count. It has to be an accredited journalist on a allegedly neutral network. So she has to do that. She's locked into the interview. She's locked into the debate. And I think what they're hoping is that she'll nail the interview and give an acceptable enough performance in the debate that she can then go back to basically her basement strategy for the rest of the campaign. I think she is looking at it like there's two hurdles she has to cross. And if she can cross them, she's in pretty good shape. But a debate has never been her strongest venue. And she's laying it all on the line with that debate and to some extent with this interview. So we've never seen anything like this before where a candidate is anointed 3.5 months before a general election. So the stakes are just completely different. But another thing people have forgotten about is Joe Biden. He was mentioned twice. He was mentioned twice at the Democratic convention. Trump was mentioned something like 149 times by the main speakers, not to mention the secondary ones. So we can see the strategy is to do everything they can to scare the bejesus out of the American public about another Donald Trump term. And for them, hopefully, turn this into a referendum on Trump instead of a referendum on the Biden-Harris administration.
Well, that's the interesting aspect of it, isn't it? Because although Kamala Harris is not Joe Biden, she was as close to being Joe Biden as anybody else in the political sphere, being his number two. So his record is her record.
Well, especially since she was placed in charge of an issue that has exploded in the Democrats' faces like nothing else. And that, of course, is the southern border. She didn't visit but once. And she went, when she did go, she went to El Paso.
She hasn't been to Europe either. What's your point?
She made, 1 or 2 trips to South America, threw some money at the governments down there. And apparently that was the root of the problem. They needed more American assistance. I'm being sarcastic, but the point is she has no credentials to speak of. So, other than as a law enforcement officer, and she's trying to play that up, and she should. She was the attorney general of the largest state in the country. She was a district attorney in one of the largest cities in the country. She was vice president. She was a senator. So, she, by this point, should be pretty good at debating. But of course, it was her debate in 2019 where Tulsi Gabbard laid her to waste, and she had to pull out shortly thereafter.
Yes, I remember it very, very clearly. I think it was about 24 seconds of just hammering Kamala Harris on the very things that she should be proudest of the most. And once they take away your crowning achievements, there's really nowhere else you can pull back from. And it would be my strong suspicion that Donald Trump is currently putting together a series of Gabbard-esque sound bites that he can launch during the debate when it happens. And they can be very effective because Donald Trump knows how to deliver a soundbite, and Kamala Harris doesn't know how to deliver a soundbite. She delivers the anti-sound. I don't even know what that
But
is.
I think we
The
need to
silent
move
spew.
forward, unburdened by what was.
Well, let's discuss
Mark,
that for a moment, Tim.
unburdened by
Unburdened.
what was.
So she wants to move forward, unburdened by what has been. Does she mean her record as vice president? Because if she can unburden herself of that, I mean, that's got to serve her well, right?
There is a record. That's her problem. She can't erase the record. The media will do the best they can to erase it. What you see in the media now, you want to talk about, not that we need any more evidence of media bias, but even some of the more responsible mainstream journalists, and I think of someone like Jonathan Karl on ABC and there's some others, who, when she was appointed as the root causes or whatever you want to call it, they announced that she had been named border czar. Border czar. You can see it in stories all through the administration. Border czar Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris in charge of the border. And yet now those same people, including Jonathan Karl, are saying, well, you know, she never really was actually the border czar. I mean, that's just such rank dishonesty.
Yeah. Are they lying now or were they lying then? Either way.
This is a woman that 2 months ago, we were having a discussion about whether Kamala Harris would be dumped from the ticket because she was such a liability to Joe Biden beyond his own declining cognitive condition. I mean, there was serious talk about trying to install someone else because her approval numbers, they were as low as 28% at one point and have never risen above the 30s. So now the media's job is to remake her and to say that 2020 Kamala, the radical San Francisco progressive, that's been like an Etch-a-Sketch, wipe it clean and create another picture of her. And they're more than willing to do that. Let's put it this way. If it was reversed and Kamala Harris was a Republican, she probably would have, she'd probably be down by 10 points if you flip the script, because there's such an incuriosity among elite media about Kamala Harris. They're not even demanding, not even asking her to actually do an interview. They're perfectly content to have her make their job much harder. They're more than willing to do it for the cause.
Well, it's all about carrying of water, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
we saw this before the fateful debate, Joe Biden with Donald Trump. Oh, and by the way, on a side note, Kamala Harris should be worried about the debate, not only because she's not very good at sound bites, she's not that great at thinking on her feet when it comes to a debate format, but the last person who debated Donald Trump had to end his campaign. That we should always keep that in mind. One debate killed his campaign.
What comes out in a debate, excuse me, in a debate format tends to be a person's authenticity, a person's substance, a person's core, or lack thereof. Right? It's pretty hard to fake authenticity. It's pretty hard to fake sincerity, to fake substance. You can use the words, but you can tell when there's nothing behind it. So this is a huge test for her. And we're either going to find that we were right, that she, the emperor has no clothes, or we will discover that we have been underrating her political skill all along. that 2019 and 20 was an aberration. She got caught up in the progressive moment. That wasn't really her. She's actually a tough on crime district attorney, and she can sell that vision to the American people. It's going to be one or the other.
I think I know which side my money's on there. We'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. We're continuing our special long form with Tim Donner, Liberty Nation senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show. We've covered, Tim, we've run the gamut, haven't we? We've talked RFK, we've talked how that's going to impact the polls. We've talked about the new party switch. We've talked Kamala Harris. So let's talk the election in general. Do you think that James Carville's admonishment of "it's the economy, stupid" still holds true for this election?
I hate to hedge my bets. What most political analysts like me do is they give an answer and then they say, on the other hand. That's
of course.
The mother's milk of political analysts. But this is an election with so many variables in it. And I know, as editor-in-chief, you always say to us at libertynation.com, don't use the word unprecedented, because the chances are in every instant it happened before. Well, we've had about...
I should point out, I learned that from your good lady wife.
Yes, from the executive editor. Yes. And so when a candidate is nearly assassinated, when the other candidate experiences a frightening meltdown before a world audience, when you have the guy pulled out of the race, basically a palace coup to knock him out, and then install somebody who never got a single vote in 2020 either, or 24. I don't know how you can reasonably assess the race until we get well into September, because people are just getting used to Kamala Harris now. They're used to her being something of a laugh line as vice president, but now they're being forced to take her seriously. So they're going to give her a fresh look. But the fundamentals of the economy and inflation and the border are very much in place. It's always the economy is the most significant issue, which is why Kamala Harris, her one issue is Trump, because she can't win on the economy. She can't win on the border. I don't think she thinks she can win just on abortion, though maybe she does, because she hits that message hard. So I think she has to deflect like they've done. They've made Donald Trump the issue in 2016, 2020, 2024. They failed once, they succeeded once. So now they'll break the tie to see if simply running a campaign of not being Donald Trump and being a pretty face, an attractive woman of color, that's going to have to be enough for her, because she's not going to win on issues. She's going to win on demonizing Donald Trump. We've seen it all before. And, again, one win, one loss. And now the whole future of the Republic, it seems, rests on the outcome of this election. And I'm not exaggerating in the sense that the difference, we talked about this earlier, the difference between a Trump victory and going into a full MAGA era, as opposed to a Harris victory and the cementing of the progressive era. I mean, I'd say the choice is so significant for people to make that I'm not sure they've really even processed how important it is at this point. But one thing they do have, and I think in the end, this is going to count for a lot, is the rare thing about this election, in addition to all the weird things that have happened, is that you've got two presidents with a record running against each other. Now, of course, Biden isn't running anymore, but essentially you've got a record that one candidate has compiled and a record that the other candidate has compiled. There should be no talk about here's what I would do, here's what I want to do, here's what I should do. It's all about here's what you did, and here was the result. And I think it really stands to Trump's benefit to, were you better off 4 years ago than you are now?
Leaving the policy aspect aside, so now she's saying that here are some broad stroke things that she will do. She will fix the economy. She will fix immigration. She will do this, do that. And if Donald Trump says that now, well, that's actually all well and good, because he's been 3.5 years out of office and there's been substantial changes to the X, Y, and Z that he says he's going to fix. Mm-hmm. Whereas Kamala Harris saying that she's going to fix the X, Y, and Z, it doesn't ring entirely true, because she's in office now in the number 2 slot. And she hasn't fixed the things that she's doing. I guess a good analogy here would be, I hired somebody to do some work, and they said they were going to do this work, and they haven't done it. And now it's time for their annual pay rise and promotion. And they're saying that, well, if you give me the pay rise and promotion, I'll do all the things that I said I was going to do before.
Right. I think of the first cartoon that our Liberty Nation's wonderful cartoonist, Tom Stiglitz, the very first cartoon we ran on the site, which was about a year ago, and it had a caricature of Joe Biden standing up there saying, elect me and I will fix all the problems I created over the last 4 years. And, essentially you can't. There have been times, look, when a vice president will run somewhat apart from a president, most famously Al Gore, who decided that he didn't want the legacy of Clinton behind him. And I'm not so sure that was a good decision, because Clinton, for all his foibles, was at about 60% approval when he left office.
Everybody likes Clinton, at least Bill.
Mostly because the economy was in really good shape, and that's why he got 2 terms in office. In 1960, Richard Nixon didn't really break from Dwight Eisenhower, but he had a very different agenda when he elevated from vice president to run for president against John F. Kennedy. So there's some legitimacy to breaking to some degree from the president who brought you into office, but not when the man was forced out against his will. And the person who replaced him is someone who was on nobody's radar 2 or 3 months ago.
And I think the important question is still out there, Tim, that at some point somebody is going to ask, what did she know about Joe Biden's cognitive decline?
When did she know it?
Exactly.
And of course, the answer is she knew it on day one. But, one of the problems, honestly, Mark, that Donald Trump has is it's such a target-rich environment. There are so many potential lines of attack. You can't use all of them. You have to pick your spots, and that's not always easy.
Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for joining us on this special edition today. Much appreciated.
Lots of fun, Mark. Thank you.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'd like to remind everybody that while our writers may support political candidates or parties, Liberty Nation itself does not support any candidate or party. I'd like to thank Tim Donner for being here and bringing us all the latest analysis. And of course, thank you, the listeners at home, for taking the time to tune in each and every week. You are appreciated.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.